In late July 1943, Hamburg, Germany's vital port city, faced an unprecedented challenge from the United States 8th Air Force, B-17, flying fortresses operating from bases in England, targeted shipyards and U-boat facilities along the Elbe River. German air defense under Luftwaffe command relied on flak belts, smoke screens, and fighter squadrons stationed at nearby airfields like Stade. Hamburg's industrial heart, producing warships and submarines, was believed secure due to its distance from England 600 miles across the North Sea and frequent cloud cover. On 25 July, American bombers arrived in daylight, flying at 26,000 feet, aiming for precision strikes on naval construction sites. German flak guns fired, forcing some B-17 seconds to adjust altitude, while Messerschmitt Bf 109s and Focke-Wulf W190s scrambled to intercept. The Luftwaffe expected heavy American losses, assuming daylight raids were unsustainable. Yet the B-17 seconds' tight formations and defensive gunners limited German fighter success. Anti-aircraft shells burst across the sky, but many bombers pressed through, dropping payloads on Blohm and Voss shipyards. German commanders noted the attack's focused docks and repair facilities critical for U-boat operations were hit with measurable effect. Damage reports confirmed disrupted production lines, though not yet catastrophic. The Luftwaffe's radar network, part of the Kammhuber line, tracked the raiders but struggled with coordination under daylight conditions. Ammunition for flak batteries depleted faster than planned stocks for one raid consumed in hours. The core metric was range. American B-17 seconds proved they could reach 600 miles and return, challenging Hamburg's assumed geographic shield. German officers in Berlin received initial reports with concern, but held that one raid was manageable. Then, on 26 July, the Americans returned, signaling no pause. Hamburg's defenders faced a new reality: the United States could sustain daylight operations. Flak crews reloaded under pressure. Fighters burned fuel in repeated climbs. The city's civil defense, designed for sporadic attacks, braced for more. On the night of 27th to 28th July 1943, RAF Bomber Command escalated the assault on Hamburg. Lancaster and Halifax bombers, flying under cover of darkness, unleashed thousands of incendiaries, exploiting a new tactic window. Strips of aluminum foil dropped by the RAF confused German radar, disrupting the Kammhuber line's ability to vector night fighters. German controllers watched screens blur with false echoes, unable to guide Messerschmitt Bf 110s effectively. The incendiaries ignited fires across residential and industrial districts, merging into a firestorm that consumed entire neighborhoods. Winds reached hurricane force, pulling oxygen from shelters and turning streets into rivers of flame. Gauleiter Karl Kaufmann, Hamburg's regional leader, reported to Berlin that tens of thousands were dead or missing, with whole quarters reduced to ash. Fire brigades, overwhelmed, lacked water as mains ruptured. Reinforcements from nearby cities were summoned but arrived too late. The core metric sortie rate underscored the crisis. RAF launched over 700 sorties in one night, compounding the American daylight raids. German air defenses, calibrated for single-night attacks, could not reset fast enough. The Luftwaffe's night fighters, grounded or misdirected, left Hamburg exposed. On 29 July, the 8th Air Force returned, bombing shipyards again at 26,000 feet, proving the Allies could strike day and night without pause. German commanders now saw the flaw in their defense: no recovery time between raids. Ammunition stocks for flak guns dwindled after 3 major attacks in 5 days. The constraint was clear: Hamburg's defenses required constant resupply to function. Civilian reports described chaos factories, halted rail lines, severed, and morale shaken as the city burned. The combined Anglo-American campaign revealed a truth to German planners: no city could withstand such relentless pressure. Hamburg's air defenses, engineered for sporadic raids, buckled under the relentless July 1943 onslaught. The Luftwaffe, structured around the assumption of predictable intervals between attacks, faced an unprecedented challenge: American B-17, flying fortresses by day, and RAF Bomber Command's Lancasters and Halifaxes by night, with no pause to recalibrate. The British use of window strips of aluminum foil dropped in clouds disrupted the Kammhuber line's radar network, rendering night fighter coordination nearly impossible. German controllers stared at screens cluttered with false echoes, unable to vector Messerschmitt Bf-110s to intercept RAF bombers. On the night of 27th to 28th July, incendiaries ignited fires that merged into a firestorm, consuming residential districts and industrial zones along the Elbe River. Winds reaching hurricane strength tore through streets, pulling oxygen from shelters and turning asphalt into molten channels. By day, American B-17 seconds, flying at 26,000 feet, pressed through flak and fighter attacks to strike U-boat yards and rail hubs critical for naval production. German pilots climbing repeatedly to engage reported fuel shortages after burning through reserves in high-altitude pursuits. Ground crews tasked with maintaining Focke-Wulf W-190s and Messerschmitt Bf-109s faced engine overhauls after 50 hours at full throttle. Anti-aircraft batteries firing across 5 days of raids exhausted ammunition stocks calculated for monthly use. Hamburg's defenders, expecting to repel single raids, found no reprieve as the Allies maintained a punishing sortie rate over 700 RAF bombers in one night, followed by hundreds of American B-17 seconds in daylight. German commanders in Hamburg signalled Berlin with growing alarm, the city's 600-mile distance from England, once a protective barrier, no longer deterred the 8th Air Force. Luftwaffe officers stationed at airfields like Stade cursed the tight American formations, their defensive gunners shredding interceptors with disciplined fire. The adversary's realization cut sharply. Allied bombers could strike twice within 24 hours, ignoring North Sea weather and flak belts. Albert Speer-Reich, Minister of Armaments and War Production, toured Hamburg's smouldering ruins and warned Berlin that the city's destruction outpaced any hope of rebuilding. Factories, rail lines and docks vital for U-boat construction lay in heaps of twisted steel and ash. Speer's report to Berlin underscored a grim necessity. Industry must disperse to smaller towns or underground sites to survive. Hamburg's civil defense, designed for brief attacks, proved inadequate as shelters suffocated under firestorm conditions with oxygen drained by flames. Gauleiter Karl Kaufmann, Hamburg's regional leader, reported tens of thousands dead or missing with entire quarters reduced to rubble. Fire brigades depleted of water and equipment called for aid from neighbouring cities, but arriving crews found streets impassable and hydrants dry. The port's output critical for Germany's naval war plummeted, as workshops and cranes stood idle, their skilled workers dead, injured or scattered. The Luftwaffe's tactical assumptions unravelled. The Kammhuber Line, a network of radar-guided fighter zones, relied on predictable raid patterns to vector aircraft efficiently. Windows interference shattered this system, leaving night fighters grounded or misdirected. By day, American B-17 seconds, protected by their overlapping fields of fire, forced German pilots to attack at altitudes that strained engines and consumed fuel. The Luftwaffe's interceptors, already stretched by losses on other fronts, could not sustain the pace. German air defense planners who had banked on layered defenses, flak smoke screens and fighters, saw their strategy collapse under the weight of consecutive raids. The Allies' ability to replace aircraft and crews outpaced Germany's, a fact evident in the B-17 seconds return on 29 July, bombing shipyards with precision despite heavy opposition. The core metric sortie rate haunted German commanders. The Allies could launch hundreds of bombers daily, overwhelming Hamburg's defences. Flak batteries firing thousands of shells faced resupply delays as rail lines to ammunition depots were severed. The constraint was stark. Hamburg's guns required constant restocking to remain operational, a logistical challenge unmet during the crisis. For the German public, the shock was not only the physical destruction, but the realization that the enemy could return at will. Civilians emerging from shelters described streets transformed into fiery canyons with heat so intense it melted glass. The Hamburg raids shattered the myth of northern Germany's invulnerability. Pre-war planners had assumed distance and weather would deter sustained bombing. July 1943 proved otherwise. The Luftwaffe, tasked with protecting the Reich's cities, faced a sobering truth. Existing fighter strength and radar control could not stop a coordinated Anglo-American campaign focused on a single target. Speer's conclusion that industry must scatter to survive marked a strategic pivot driven by Hamburg's devastation. The raids exposed Germany's vulnerability to a new kind of air war, one that combined American daylight precision with British nighttime firestorms. Hamburg's defenders, once confident in their layered protections, now grappled with a relentless enemy capable of hammering a city without pause. The Allies, observing the chaos, took Hamburg as proof that sustained bombing could overwhelm German defences, setting the stage for broader campaigns against the Reich's industrial heartland. Hamburg's devastation in July 1943 forced German leadership to confront an unravelling strategic foundation. The Luftwaffe, tasked with shielding the Reich, faced a sobering reality: neither radar nor fighters could halt the Anglo-American air offensive. The Kammhuber line, crippled by RAF window tactics, failed to guide night fighters against British bombers, leaving Hamburg's skies open to incendiary raids. American B-17 seconds, flying at 26,000 feet, pressed daylight attacks on U-boat yards and rail lines, shrugging off flak and interceptors. German pilots, climbing to engage burned fuel reserves in futile pursuits, their aircraft requiring overhauls after 50 hours at maximum effort. Anti-aircraft batteries firing across 5 days, exhausted shells meant for weeks with resupply stalled by damaged rail networks. The core metric sortie rate haunted Berlin. The Allies sustained hundreds of bombers daily, a pace Hamburg's defences could not match. Gauleiter Karl Kaufmann's reports detailed catastrophic losses: tens of thousands dead, hundreds of thousands homeless, and entire districts reduced to smouldering rubble. Fire brigades, overwhelmed by firestorms, abandoned posts as water mains failed. Albert Speer, inspecting the wreckage, reiterated his warning: industry must disperse or face annihilation. The port, a linchpin for U-boat production, saw output grind to a halt, with docks and workshops buried under debris. German commanders, once confident in Hamburg's 600-mile buffer from England, now saw distance as no deterrent. Luftwaffe officers cursed the Allies' relentless tempo. Day and night raids left no time to repair or rearm. The adversary's realization was stark. American bombers could strike twice in 24 hours, rendering flak belts and smoke screens obsolete. Civilian morale, already strained, collapsed as survivors described streets of molten asphalt and shelters turned into ovens by oxygen-starved firestorms. Berlin's pre-war assumption that northern cities were less vulnerable lay in ruins alongside Hamburg's port. The Luftwaffe, stretched across multiple fronts, could not replace pilots or aircraft at the Allies' rate. Speer's push for industrial dispersal gained urgency with orders to relocate key production to smaller towns or underground sites. This shift demanded labour and materials Germany could ill afford, as skilled workers were killed or displaced in the raids. Hamburg's civil defence, designed for limited strikes, proved useless against consecutive attacks, with shelters and fire services overwhelmed by the firestorm's scale. The raids exposed a deeper flaw. Germany's air defence strategy relied on predictable raid intervals, allowing time to reset radar refuel fighters and restock flak guns. July 1943 shattered this model. The Allies' combined campaign, American precision by day, British area bombing by night, created a relentless cycle that paralysed Hamburg's recovery. Rail hubs critical for moving U-boat components were severed, delaying naval production across the Reich. The Luftwaffe's inability to counter the Allies' sortie rate forced a grim reassessment. Existing fighter strength could not protect a single city under focused attack. German authorities began evacuating women and children from other threatened cities, anticipating similar campaigns. Speer's reports to Berlin emphasized Hamburg's lesson: no urban center could function under sustained bombing. The public's shock was palpable. Hamburg, a symbol of industrial might, was now a warning of vulnerability. The Allies, emboldened by the city's collapse, refined their strategy, planning to replicate Hamburg's destruction elsewhere. For Germany, the raids marked a turning point. The air war had shifted from heavy but manageable to strategically catastrophic, demanding a complete overhaul of defense and production priorities. Hamburg's ruins in late July 1943 stood as a stark testament to the Reich's vulnerability. The city, once a powerhouse of U-boat production and maritime trade, lay crippled with tens of thousands dead and hundreds of thousands displaced. Industrial output along the Elbe River stalled as shipyards, rail hubs, and warehouses smouldered under debris. The 8th Air Force's B-17 seconds, striking at 26,000 feet, had targeted docks and repair facilities with precision, while RAF Bomber Command's Firestorm incinerated residential and industrial districts alike. German authorities faced a logistical nightmare. Fire brigades from neighbouring cities summoned to aid Hamburg found water mains destroyed and streets blocked by rubble. Gauleiter Karl Kaufmann's reports to Berlin detailed a city unable to function with civilian services overwhelmed and morale shattered. Survivors spoke of hurricane-like winds and shelters suffocating as flames consumed oxygen. The Luftwaffe, tasked with protecting the Reich, could not counter the Allies' relentless sortie rate hundreds of bombers daily sustained over 5 days. Anti-aircraft batteries depleted after firing thousands of shells faced delays in resupply. Ammunition trains were stalled by bombed rail lines. Fighter squadrons burning fuel in repeated climbs required overhauls after 50 hours at full throttle. German leadership, stunned by Hamburg's collapse, accelerated plans to adapt. Albert Speer-Reich, Minister of Armaments and War Production, pushed for immediate dispersal of industry to smaller towns and underground facilities, a move requiring scarce resources and labour. U-boat production, critical to Germany's naval strategy, faced months of delays as Hamburg's shipyards lay in ruins. Berlin ordered wider evacuations of women and children from cities at risk, anticipating further Allied campaigns. The Luftwaffe, its radar network disrupted by RAF window tactics, scrambled to develop countermeasures, but time was short. German commanders cursed the Allies' ability to strike day and night American B-17 seconds, and British Lancasters exploited Hamburg's 600-mile proximity to England, ignoring weather barriers. The adversary's realization was bitter. No defense could stop a coordinated Anglo-American assault. Civilian accounts of burning streets and collapsed shelters spread fear, undermining the Reich's narrative of resilience. The Allies, analyzing Hamburg's destruction, saw confirmation of their strategy-sustained bombing could paralyze a city's infrastructure and defenses. The raids forced Germany to divert resources from other fronts, weakening its broader war effort. Skilled workers needed for tank and aircraft production were redirected to clear debris and repair Hamburg's port. The Luftwaffe, unable to match the Allies' aircraft replacement rate, prioritized northern airfields, leaving southern fronts exposed. Speer's dispersal plan, while necessary, strained Germany's overstretched economy as new sites demanded materials and transport already in short supply. Hamburg's lesson reshaped German strategy. Urban centers were no longer defensible, and civil defense systems designed for single raids collapsed under consecutive strikes. The Allies, emboldened, planned to replicate Hamburg's devastation in other industrial hubs, leveraging their ability to maintain high sortie rates. For the German public, the shock was profound, not only the loss of homes and lives, but the realization that the enemy could return at will, unchecked by distance or weather. Hamburg's fall marked a psychological and strategic shift, signaling that the air war had become a relentless force capable of breaking Germany's industrial backbone. The Hamburg raids of July 1943 etched a permanent mark on Germany's war effort, revealing a Reich exposed to relentless Allied air power. The city's port, once the heart of U-boat production, lay in ruins with shipyards and docks reduced to charred steel and debris. The 8th Air Force's B-17 seconds, striking at 26,000 feet, had crippled naval facilities, while RAF Bomber Command's Firestorm consumed entire districts, leaving tens of thousands dead and hundreds of thousands homeless. German authorities faced a paralyzed industrial hub, with rail lines severed and workshops buried under ash. Albert Speer-Reich, Minister of Armaments and War Production, accelerated plans to scatter factories to remote towns and underground sites, a desperate move, draining labor and materials from a war fought on multiple fronts. The Luftwaffe, its radar network disrupted by RAF window tactics, failed to counter British night raids while American daylight strikes overwhelmed fighter squadrons. Anti-aircraft batteries firing across 5 days exhausted shells meant for weeks. Resupply stalled as bombed rail networks faltered. The Allies' sortie rate, hundreds of bombers daily, overpowered Hamburg's defences, exposing Germany's inability to match the pace. The Luftwaffe's fighters climbing to intercept B-17 seconds burned fuel reserves, requiring overhauls after 50 hours at full throttle. German commanders, once confident in Hamburg's 600-mile buffer from England, saw their defensive assumptions collapse. Luftwaffe officers cursed the Allies' relentless cycle day-night raids left no time to rearm or repair. The adversary's realization was stark. No radar or fighter force could stop a coordinated Anglo-American assault. Civilian morale, battered by firestorm accounts of molten streets and suffocating shelters, crumbled as Hamburg became a symbol of vulnerability. Speer's reports to Berlin warned that centralized industry was untenable. Dispersal was now mandatory despite the strain on resources. The German Navy, reliant on Hamburg's output, faced U-boat production delays, undermining efforts to contest Allied naval supremacy. Evacuations of women and children from urban centres expanded, clogging transport and deepening public despair. The Luftwaffe stretched across Europe, diverted squadrons to northern airfields, weakening other fronts. Hamburg's destruction forced Germany into a reactive stance with long-term consequences for the war. The Allies, emboldened by the city's collapse, saw their combined bombing strategy validated, planning to target other industrial hubs with the same ferocity. The sortie rate, hundreds of bombers daily, became a relentless weapon, outpacing Germany's ability to replenish aircraft pilots or ammunition. Civil defense, designed for single raids, proved futile against firestorms that obliterated neighborhoods and infrastructure. Speer's dispersal efforts, while slowing Allied progress, could not fully offset the loss of Hamburg's production capacity. The public, hearing tales of burning streets and collapsed shelters, braced for further devastation. Their faith in the Reich's invincibility eroded. The raids marked a strategic shift. Germany's northern cities, once deemed safe, were now exposed, and the air war had become a grinding force that threatened the Reich's industrial core. Hamburg's fall signaled to the Allies that sustained bombing could dismantle Germany's war machine city by city, while the Reich scrambled to adapt to a new, unforgiving reality. The Hamburg raids of July 1943 reshaped the air war, cementing Germany's vulnerability to a relentless Anglo-American offensive. The city's port, once a linchpin for U-boat production, remained crippled, its docks and shipyards reduced to heaps of scorched metal. The 8th Air Force's B-17 seconds, bombing at 26,000 feet, had shattered naval infrastructure, while RAF Bomber Command's firestorm obliterated neighborhoods, leaving tens of thousands dead and hundreds of thousands homeless. The Allies' sortie rate, hundreds of bombers daily, overwhelmed Hamburg's defences, exposing the Reich's inability to counter sustained attacks. Albert Speer, tasked with sustaining war production, pushed for factory dispersal to remote towns and underground bunkers, a costly shift, draining labour and steel from a multi-front war. The Luftwaffe, its radar network paralysed by RAF window tactics, failed to repel British night raids, while American daylight strikes exhausted fighter squadrons. Anti-aircraft batteries, depleted after 5 days of firing, faced resupply delays as rail lines lay severed. German civilians emerging from ruined shelters described streets of molten asphalt, and bunkers turned lethal by firestorm winds, their faith in the Reich's defences shattered. Luftwaffe fighters climbing to engage, B-17 seconds burned fuel reserves, requiring overhauls after 50 hours at full throttle. German commanders, who once relied on Hamburg's 600-mile distance from England, faced a grim truth: no city was safe. Luftwaffe officers cursed the Allies' unyielding cycle day-night raids, left no time to rearm or regroup. The adversary's realization was sharp. Germany's air defences could not stop a focused Anglo-American campaign. The Kamm-Huber line, designed for predictable raids, collapsed under Windows interference, leaving night fighters misdirected. Speer's warnings to Berlin grew urgent. Without decentralized production, other industrial hubs would fall like Hamburg. The German Navy, dependent on U-boat output, grappled with production delays, weakening its Atlantic strategy. Berlin expanded evacuations, sending women and children to rural areas, clogging transport and deepening public despair. The Luftwaffe stretched across Europe, diverted squadrons to northern bases, exposing southern fronts to Allied advances. Civilian morale, battered by tales of Hamburg's destruction, eroded further as fear of future raids spread. The Allies, emboldened by Hamburg's collapse, saw their combined bombing strategy validated. The 8th Air Force honed daylight tactics, exploiting Germany's inability to replace aircraft or pilots at the Allies' pace. RAF Bomber Command, leveraging Window's success, planned more night raids to maximize destruction. The sortie rate, hundreds of bombers daily, became a relentless weapon, outpacing Germany's capacity to rebuild or rearm. Civil defense, built for single strikes, proved futile against firestorms and precision bombing. Speer's dispersal efforts, while slowing Allied progress, strained an economy already buckling under war demands. The German public, once reassured by propaganda of invincibility, now faced a reality where bombers could return at any hour, unchecked by distance or weather. Hamburg's devastation became a blueprint for the Allies, who targeted other industrial centres with the same ferocity, confident in their ability to overwhelm defences. For Germany, July 1943 marked a shift to a defensive war, where the air campaign's escalating intensity threatened to dismantle the Reich's industrial and psychological resilience city by city.